We've had a chance to discuss some RESTful routing now, and we've made a case of where it seems to fall just a little bit short. Remember, there are 3 different areas where RESTful routing seems to kind of come up with some issues. First, deciding on a URL schema gets tough when we start to have heavily nested relationships. Second, when fetching heavily nested data, we can easily run into situations where we make too many HTTP requests to get the data that we need. Third, we are vulnerable to overfetching data, where we fetch an entire company when maybe we really only needed the name property off that company. Keep in mind that with each of these issues, there are definitely problems that can be solved, but coming up with solutions like this kind of takes a lot of engineering time. So we always want to be aware of how much time we're spending on solving any given problem. And this is where GraphQL comes in and allows us to solve these issues in a very timely fashion. So in this section, I want to spend a little bit of time to tell you exactly what GraphQL does to solve each of these inherent pieces of confusion around RESTful routing. Let's think back to our diagram of our current user who is trying to fetch some details about their friends. This user had some friends, and each friend had a company and a position record associated with it. Right now, we're looking at this diagram in a sort of tree fashion, where we start with the current user, and then we look at the users they are associated with, and then we look at the associated companies and positions with them. So everything is focused around this current user, or it's all from this current user's viewpoint. Now I'm going to change up this diagram in a big way. And rather than looking at everything from the viewpoint of this single user, I want to imagine all of the data in this application, all the data in this imaginary database, including all the users, all the positions, and all the companies. So the diagram I'm going to swap to is going to look just a little bit crazy, but really it is conveying very similar information as what we're seeing right now. Okay, so let's look at it. Okay, this diagram right here shows a graph of all the relations in our application. When I say graph, I'm not talking about the type of chart you find in an Excel spreadsheet or your favorite spreadsheet application. A graph is a data structure that contains nodes, which are symbolized by all the different rectangles in here, and relations between each of these nodes, which we refer to as edges. So this is the graph that GraphQL is referring to. And understanding how our information fits into a graph data structure like this is key to understanding how GraphQL works. One thing that I want to mention about this graph structure right here is that I'm not saying that we're going to change how our data is being stored in a database or anything like that. We can still use MongoDB, Postgres, MySQL, whatever we want to use to store data. We're just looking at this diagram to kind of visualize how all of our data is connected together via all the different relations. Okay. Now that our data is organized into a graph, I'm going to take all my different users and assign some IDs to them. Once we've got all of our data in this graph structure, what do we do with it? How do we kind of query about the information that is contained in here? Well, once we have organized our data into a graph, we can query it using GraphQL. So let's see an example of what this might look like. Okay, we're going to kind of picture a GraphQL query running along this graph right here. Let's imagine that we want to start with user 23 right here. I want to find all of their friends who are other users in the application. And then I want to find all the companies that those users work at. Okay, so let's visualize how we would form a query or ask a question like that to GraphQL. Well, first, we would tell GraphQL that we wanted to go and find the user with ID 23. Next, we would tell GraphQL to go and find all the friends associated with with user 23. Finally, we would tell GraphQL to find the company associated with all of those friends and get maybe the name property off of it or something like that. So in summary, we started by telling GraphQL to go and look at a very particular record, like this record right here, and then crawl through all the records associated with it. To instruct GraphQL on how to do this in practice, we write and execute what is called a query. So let's look at a query that would do something very similar to what we just saw, like start with a particular user and then go find the associated friends companies' names. So the query that we're about to write, we're just going to do right here on the side of this diagram, is going to look really familiar once we start working with GraphQL. It's going to look like JavaScript right now. It might look a little bit weird, but trust me, we're going to get really familiar with queries with GraphQL. Okay. So this is going to be the query that we would write to go from user 23 all the way up to the company up here. First, we start off by telling GraphQL that we want to make a query. So I would say query and then open curly braces. And then I would say I want to find a user with ID of 23. That will tell GraphQL to look at this user right here. Next, we'll tell GraphQL that we want to find all the users who are friends of the initial user. So to crawl along to the next layer, or the next set of relations right here, we add in friends, like so. Now you might be curious why I'm saying friends right here and not like users again. Well, we'll talk about that, but really we could consider them to be just users as well. Either way, we're essentially telling GraphQL, kind of walk this graph a little bit, like walk to the next relation, walk to the next node. And now the last step. We go from friends to finding all of the companies associated with those friends. So I would say company, and then because I want the name property off of every single company, I would write out name, like so. Okay, so this is the first query that we're going to look at. We're going to implement this ourselves inside of a GraphQL application. I don't expect you to understand the syntax of queries at all, not whatsoever. I just want to give you an example of how we take a query and we can imagine that it is walking along a graph for every single statement in the query that we have. Okay. Let's take a quick break because this has been a lot of crazy stuff. Let's take a quick break and then start working on a practical example of this in the next section.